think about it. There's no such thing as darkness. There's no dark waves. There's light waves, but there are no dark waves. So darkness is simply the absence of light, you know? And St. Paul said that once you shine a light into the darkness becomes light, which is obvious, you know? So what then is darkness? Darkness is simply what we don't see and what we don't know. And I don't know if I need to tell you much. I was a Jewish infant born in Budapest 2 months before the Nazis occupied the country, and I spent the first year of my life as a Jewish infant with a mother under Nazi occupation, under the threat of death and starvation and so on. And
stressful,
one might say, you know. and as an infant, one absorbs one's parents' stresses, and you can't help it. And so, you know, after the death of her parents in Auschwitz, the abduction into forced labor of my father, she didn't know if he was dead or alive for at least half a year or more. Poor conditions in the country, and then this vicious right-wing dictatorship, separation from me for 6 weeks to save my life. So you can imagine what I grew, you know, what the imprints would have been and what the impact would have been. Come back to those, what you mentioned earlier, but the big T and the small T. You don't need to have these big dramatic events for children to be hurt. The big T traumatic events are war, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, a parent dying, parent being jailed. Those are the traumatic events. But trauma meaning a wound, you don't need these traumatic events to wound a child. As a matter of fact, I would say, dramatic as my infancy sounds, and certainly historically was, I wasn't as wounded as a lot of kids in good middle-class homes here in Canada in peacetime. Because apart from, not that I want to compare traumas, but my big traumas happened in the first year of my life due to circumstances that were outside my family, for the most part. Not my parents were perfect. They were not. And certainly emotionally, they never did understand me very well. But other than that, it was quite a functional family with parents who loved each other and respected each other and loved their kids after the war, once they were reunited. But a lot of kids grow up in families where there's a lot of inter-partner stress, relational stress. The father may have an addiction, or the mother may have an addiction. There might be unresolved traumas that both partners are carrying. And that goes on for years and years and years. And those are what we call the small T traumas, you know, where it's not big and dramatic and self-evident, but children's needs are not being met, and a child can be wounded. So the reason when I do talk about my own trauma, just to be transparent about my own history, but I also don't want to create the impression that you need those big ticket events for children to be hurt. Children are hurt regularly in this culture.
You know, maybe it's because I'm a Gen X. I mean, I had grandparents and older uncles and great uncles that fought in a war that they didn't want to as teenagers. Yeah. And, you know, they would always, actually, they would almost never share their experiences with us because they were, I suspect, so traumatic, those experiences for them. You know, later on in life, I would hear from that generation often. Yeah. What do you know about problems? Like real problems are getting shot in the leg, or real problems are starving in a trench for a week, you know, that sort of stuff. But yeah, the smaller T's, the smaller T's, I guess, they're much more insidious because they really don't show up and unless you pay attention, I think.
Yeah. Well, a very simple one is, if somebody shows up with a problem like addiction or you know, mental health problem or autoimmune disease, I might ask them, how's your childhood? They said, I had a happy childhood. And children, yeah. If your children felt sad or unhappy or lonely, who would you want to talk to? Oh, I want them to talk to me. If they didn't talk to you, how would you understand that? Oh, well, they didn't trust me. They didn't feel safe. I said, there's your happy childhood. But people don't remember what didn't happen because they
Yes.
only had the one life. They can
Yes.
remember if they were hit, maybe, but they won't remember that they weren't listened to. That can be wounding to a child, significantly wounding to a child.
Well, so those kinds of details, not remembering what didn't happen to you, started to come back when I became a young parent, or when I became a parent. I started to understand a little bit more about what wasn't communicated to me when I was a kid, when I had one of my own in front of me.
Well, that's a powerful way to get to know yourself, is to become a parent.
That's true. For better or for worse. Yeah.
Well, ideally for the better, because the better you know yourself, the better parent you'll be.
Yeah, I agree. So on that, still on the subject, I've heard you say this before, that speaking of environment and sensitivity to the environment, for some reason, infant boys, in your research and your work, you have found to be more sensitive to their environment and stresses in their environment than girls.
That's not my research. That's the research of a lot of other people. I've simply cited. Mm-hmm. Yeah, boys are more sensitive. They're more easily hurt, actually, and yet they're treated more roughly than girls are. It's a really bad combination, you know.
As a former boy, I would attest to that. I remember wanting. So I remember always being envious of other boys who were more rambunctious in class, because they were the more confident ones, it seemed like.
Yeah.
But they were the ones always to have like the silly ideas, like that people would laugh at, or they couldn't sit still. And those are the first ones that were targeted by the teacher.
That's right.
Because they were behaving outside of the normal, quote unquote.
And those were usually the sensitive kids. I mean, my first book was about ADHD. It's called Scattered Minds. And actually, what's astonishing is that book was published in 1999, 24 years ago. And 2 weeks ago, it reappeared on the Canadian National Bestseller List in the Globe and Mail. But that ADHD, the difficulty sitting still, the tuning out, it's actually a reflection of the environment. When sensitive, so those boys were very sensitive. And the more sensitive you are, the more troubled you are when things go wrong. And then the more you have to cope with that stress by tuning out. So you develop this so-called disease, which is not a disease at all, called ADHD. And then the teachers will punish you.
That was the worst kind of punishment for me in a 30-person class, to be singled out by the teacher for that kind of reason. So I always avoided that behavior.
I've had adults sitting in my office in their 30s and 40s, shedding tears about something a teacher said to them when they were 12 years old.
A stunted life.
Well, adults don't realize how much power they actually have to both benefit and nourish, but also to hurt children. In fact, the two powers are completely